Welcome to what I think is episode three. Today, Wayne is not with us, but I've asked a business partner, a colleague, an old friend, John Prairie, to join us. I'm going to ask John to introduce himself here in just a minute, but beforehand, I'd like to say I've known John for 23 years. I did the math today, and I
Oh
think
my
that's
God.
right. Yeah, a long, long time.
Oh,
And I will refer to John as JP. That's what most of his friends, how most of his friends refer to him. So don't be surprised if I switch up JP for John from time to time. But John previously, when I first met him, he helped by way of his company Restoration Systems fund part of my dissertation when I studied dam removal and the ecological consequences thereof at the University of North Carolina. John is a longtime Tar Heel, has dedicated a lot of his free time to the university. So, for several reasons, I'm a big fan of this guy, but that's not the least of which that I am. And then also, after I graduated with my PhD, I was watching a lot of very bright people in my field run their heads into the wall trying to get an academic job. John and his business partner, George, offered me a job shortly after, and I took it. Worked for JP for 3 years, ultimately parted in the best of terms, but I moved to Texas and started my own business, Riverbank Conservation, in 2009. And JP and I have collaborated, have partnered, have worked together various ways over those years. And now JP and I are partners on Lesser Prairie Chicken Conservation, LPC Conservation. So JP is in the trenches on the chicken. He's got a great perspective, and he's been helping me pitch the 250 for 250 to basically anybody in DC with a pulse. So I asked JP to come on board and help us describe what the vision actually is. So with that, JP, I'd like to hand it to you. Just give a brief introduction to yourself and your background for the audience.
one of the things that that's a long timeline there, and I've got to go back even farther, which is tough for me to do. But I worked once upon a time on the Hill on the Senate side, working on Endangered Species Act issues in the mid '90s, and I have had a great interest in all things related to ESA, as well as other environmental permitting issues like wetland and stream mitigation, which is uh, obviously a big thing on the eastern half of the United States, where in North Carolina, a large part of the eastern half of the state has a great deal of wetland habitat. So I've got to date myself a little bit because I worked on what was the original mitigation banking guidance for what became an industry that we're now part of when I was working in the Senate back in 1995. And that's sort of the impetus for when George Howard and I decided that there was a business opportunity here and how the private sector could do things that government or industry had historically not been good at doing. We thought that there was sort of an opportunity there to create a business that would specialize in permitting compliance, but do it with a environmental outcome that was the highest, best possible outcome. And fast forwarding up to when Adam and I met, it was really through one of the dedicated career U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employees who was in North Carolina that had been a strong proponent of the benefits of removing dams because of all the bad things that happen to aquatic systems by virtue of a dam being put in a river, and you end up going from a free flowing river to what is a stagnant loadic environment that's bad for all kind of reasons. And when Adam was doing his PhD, it was through our friend with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that we met. So I have high regard for the dedication of a lot of the folks at the service and the good that they can do through their regulatory role. And I've got to say, our friend in Raleigh was one of the most encouraging of all federal regulatory folks I've ever known about the benefits of private sector involvement in getting a better outcome for the resource, which is sort of a segue to where we are today on the work with the lesser prairie chicken. And we're trying to get a better outcome for not only the resource, but we also have a unique opportunity with the LPC to help restore, protect an American heritage in the grasslands and the native prairie that so many settlers that headed from the eastern part of the country to go west traversed. And it's unlike any landscape I've ever seen in the United States. It is truly unique. And you have got wildlife, including the lesser prairie chicken, but you have got the type of grasslands that support cattle in a way and that is in scale in a way that just you can't imagine until you see it. So I think that what we're doing right now is hugely important for not just everyone that is wanting to get a better outcome on how the Endangered Species Act works.
This is an innovative way to handle deregulation or handle regulation, however you choose to look at it, when it comes to the Endangered Species Act. So, just to frame everything for the audience here, the bird was listed in 2014 by Fish and Wildlife Service. That was the second time they looked at listing the bird. I believe in the late 90s, forgive me on the history here, maybe 1998, give or take. They made a determination that the bird should be listed, but it was precluded because they had other priorities at the time. They just needed to focus on other species. So that means that back in the late 90s, it was warranted. Then in 2014, they got back around to assessing the status of the lesser prairie chicken. They determined it was warranted and listed it as threatened. Immediately, Permian Basin Petroleum Association and other oil and gas interests filed suit because they felt like there was a violation in APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, which is hugely important when it comes to regulatory decisions. You have to follow a prescribed pathway. If you stray even the slightest bit from the path, then oftentimes the courts can throw out the regulatory result and it goes back to the service. So that's exactly what happened after the 2014 decision. The courts in Midland, federal court in Midland, I believe that was Judge Janelle, decided to throw the listing decision out because Fish and Wildlife Service didn't adequately consider the potential of voluntary conservation programs and the effect that they would have on conserving habitat. So that was 2016, give or take, when it was delisted. Then finally, Biden's Fish and Wildlife Service came back. They had another listing decision. Again, it was warranted. This time it was warranted as threatened in the northern range. That's Colorado, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And then they decided it should be endangered in the southern range. That's New Mexico and Texas. So lo and behold, 2023, that became final. Immediately, oil and gas interests, again, Permian Basin Petroleum Association, filed suit. And then a separate suit, I believe, which was later merged, the three Republican states attorneys general of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas also filed suit. And ultimately, they prevailed by way of settlement. So where we're at right now is the bird is no longer listed, but the service is once again going through a listing determination process. And so that's where we come in, and that's where our innovative idea of 250 for 250 hopefully will lead to a win-win-win. Win for the regulatory community, that's the regulated community rather, that's oil and gas, that's utilities that are putting up transmission lines, that's renewable energy interest, as well as ranching interest, so that we don't have a listing or we have a decision that's not warranted. A win for the chicken because it's 250 for 250, as I'll describe it in just a second, involves a boatload of conservation, permanent conservation, and permanent management for the lesser prairie chicken. So we're giving the lesser prairie chicken the habitat it needs. And then finally, a win for the ranchers because the habitat is on working operational ranches.
So, Adam, what you were just describing is what I call the ping pong ball of listing status. So, in 11 years, the listing status of the LPC has changed 4 times. Now, that's crazy. And when, depending on the data you want to look at a minimum, it's $850 billion that's going to be spent over the next 10 years in the heart of the LPC range in the Permian Basin. Some numbers go up to as high as 1.5 trillion on energy and transmission. And you cannot do that with an uncertain status of, 4 times in 11 years, it goes back and forth like a ping pong ball. You have to provide certainty. And the best way to do that is by putting together the acres to effectively recover the bird in a way that it is forever off of the list. And it's doable. And it's the exact type of thing that a transformative, outside the box, disruptive administration ought to consider doing, because it's the thing that's going to actually work, as opposed to incremental efforts that have been tried in the past only to be reversed with legal challenges. And I think that that's the compelling thing about 250 for 250.
That's right, and I appreciate you summing up just like that. And this is an idea where we use appropriated money, existing government programs to deregulate the Southern Great Plains so that you can get $1 trillion plus invested without the slightest regulatory hiccup. And the way to do that, 250 for 250 really means 250,000 acres of lesser prairie chicken habitat for the nation's 250th birthday. And that happens to coincide with the current listing decision process. Right now, Fish and Wildlife is quickly approaching a November 30th, 2026 deadline for determining whether the lesser prairie chicken should be listed. And so what we're doing is we've been discussing with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Interior, a program that would utilize USDA programs and USDA dollars that are already appropriated to pay for those 250,000 acres that we need. So in a nutshell, what 250 for 250 uses is an act from 2023 called the Sustains Act. That's a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president that got together, and they wanted to find a way to funnel non-federal money, really corporation dollars, towards NRCS programs. That's the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And the NRCS programs are huge on the Southern Great Plains. They do programs like Conservation Reserve Program, CRP. They do programs like ACEP, that's the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, and they have a whole slew of others that ranchers and farmers utilize on an annual basis across the Southern Great Plains and the Northern Great Plains. So using the Sustains Act, we can take corporate money, that could be oil and gas, that could be utilities, that could be nonprofits like WAFWA that have oil and gas money for mitigation purposes, anything like that. It could be McDonald's, it can be whatever corporation wants to contribute to the cause, and use that as a match for NRCS dollars. That's dollars that Congress has already appropriated. And use those programs to then deliver what we call recovery credits. And recovery credits are where we use our programmatic conservation banking agreement, which you've heard us talk about on our podcast before. That is our agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service that dictates what it takes to provide lesser prairie chicken conservation that meets the highest fish and wildlife standards out there. And if we can put 250,000 acres of recovery credits on the board, that would give Fish and Wildlife what it needs to reach the right decision of not warranted and not listing the bird going forward. So using the Sustains Act, using NRCS programs, using our programmatic conservation banking agreement, we can put up 250,000 acres of permanent conservation for the lesser prairie chicken, and Fish and Wildlife Service can defensively reach the decision that the bird does not need to be listed. JP, anything
Right.
you'd like to add?
And I think you hit on this, but it was uh, in the Federal District Court of Midland that Judge Counts effectively sent this back to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for a determination as to whether or not the bird should be listed or not, with the deadline of this November 2026, for the service to make that determination. And that's why it's so important that the policymakers, both at the Department of Interior and at the USDA, as well as everyone at the White House involved in energy dominance. And we have had good conversations with various people at the Energy Dominance Council.
And it really turns the process upside down when you think about it. Endangered species listings typically happen because we've lost so much habitat over the preceding decades, and this is a last ditch effort to save a species. So usually when endangered species actions happen, it's too little, too late. So what you end up doing is you end up burdening the industry that shows up at the last minute in the area of habitat, and you heavily regulate that industry moving forward, when it's all the industry actions that happened in the preceding decades that really were the problem. So it's often too little, too late. And given that's exactly where we are with the lesser prairie chicken, you know, some estimates would be as little as 1% of their habitat is left. So we're just grasping at straws at this point. But you know, instead of just regulating it and charging industry out the nose to rebuild habitat, why not dedicate appropriated money using existing programs under congressional authority to go ahead and build the habitat out that the species needs, so you don't have to ask for industry to do it? And if you do it right, then you absolutely clear the decks for investment that produces returns for our economy. Those are the transmission lines, the renewable energy, the oil and gas that makes our economy hum, and of course the data centers that are tapping into all that for the AI race that's ongoing. So this is a different way of imagining regulatory action that, quite frankly, the Democrats have not done, the Republicans have not done, and I can't think of a better administration to do this than the disruptive Trump administration. I think they're in the right place to do the right thing at the right time.
And you know, one thing on the energy side, obviously you've got oil and gas exploration, you've got renewables, and where one comes down on their preference of whether it's oil, gas, you know, wind, solar, et cetera. The thing that's undeniable is that the advent of artificial intelligence and data centers is going to result in a tremendous need of transmission for whatever the fuel is for that type of energy that's going to have to be generated. And the transmission lines that we already know where they're going have a pretty good idea of the magnitude of that impact. It's going to be absolutely essential, and without it, it's hard for me to see how we maintain energy dominance in the future if we don't have the permitting certainty that something like 250 for 250 would provide.
Yeah, and by permitting certainty, you absolutely mean no permitting required under ESA.
Right.
Yep.
There you go. That's
Yeah,
right.
and you have not exactly had a front row seat in our partnership over the years in terms of closing credit deals, but you've had a second or third row seat, and you've been kept up to date by Wayne and myself as we go through these credit transactions. We have two habitat conservation plans that, while the bird was listed, we had utilities jump in on, renewable energy companies use, and it's as much as I appreciate the work that the service does, and the employees that help us in terms of approving our projects, whether that's certificates of inclusion under our habitat conservation plan or conservation bank approvals or consummating credit sales between the conservation banks and the HCP deals, I have to say it all takes too long. So if we can avoid a listing, it's in everyone's best interest. But we have to do it right. We can't just jump to a not warranted decision. We have to give the bird the conservation it needs.
And I got to jump in here because Adam was just hitting on two things that I say all the time, and it's sort of the mantra of what we do. And anybody that's listening to this, if you don't remember anything from it, remember this. Any permittee wants two things. They want certainty on price for what it's going to cost to get their permit and comply, and they want certainty on timing of when they're going to get it.
Yeah, agreed. And with the lesser prairie chicken, if we can be successful with 250 for 250, we don't have to worry about it
Right.
because we will have cleared the decks of ESA compliance concerns with respect to the chicken. So, but in areas where you do have regulated species, you have listed species, we certainly need to do better at making compliance easier because right
Yeah.
now it takes too long. And the cost can be considerable once you finally go through a multi-year process and figure out what you have to do. So it just makes it difficult to plan projects and build projects. And while the bird was listed, we had a couple of transmission projects where they had construction crews, they had materials on site sitting and waiting to drill holes and to put up poles and wire because we were waiting to finish our HCP process.
Hmm.
And it wasn't anything that we did, and it actually wasn't anything Fish and Wildlife did. It was outside agencies that had direct influence over the process that just drag it out. So we can absolutely do better. But in the case of 250 for 250, if you haven't figured it out yet, we're trying to find a way to deregulate the Southern Great Plains and clear the decks for energy dominance, including transmission. And everybody wins in that scenario. It's not just oil and gas, although I think they would stand to do well from this, but it's also renewable energy.
Right, as well as all the transmission that is related to provide the electricity to data centers going from Kansas to California, effectively.
Yep. Yep. And that happens to be a spot where we have multiple grids that need to be connected. And so the transmission projects aren't just tied to industrial use, aren't just tied to renewable use. They're also hoping to build connectivity between these grids, which improves reliability and capacity.
And one of the things that oftentimes happens when there's any sort of environmental compliance issue, the cartoon version is that industry or the black hat doesn't have any regard for it, thinks it's stupid, thinks they shouldn't have to do this. It's a burdensome requirement, et cetera. And in this case, I would encourage everyone to disabuse themselves of that kind of cartoon version because this is the heartland of the United States. And this is the native prairie that people, when they traveled in a wagon from the eastern part of the United States and were used to seeing trees wherever they went, you then enter an entirely different landscape that was the home of everything from buffalo to cattle to all kind of species that provided the sort of interesting biodiversity that you get in that landscape. And the people that are out there are the hardest working people in the world, American ranchers, people that are driving cows across vast tens of thousands of acres of short grass prairie, mixed grass prairie. And it's not just this grouse that is the lesser prairie chicken. It's these ranchers. It's a way of life that needs to be protected and recovered in addition to the LPC.
Yeah, and the cowboy is an icon in American history, and that really is today's rancher. And when you think that, or you think about only 1% of lesser prairie chicken habitat is left, 1% of the plains ecosystem is left, that really means we don't have many ranches out there anymore. We don't have many cowboys out there anymore. So this is something where we can put real value on intact grasslands and real value on being a cowboy, being a rancher. That's something that I think has, should have great importance to all of America. I mean, I've traveled a bit in my time to other countries, and they hear my accent, which is not exactly a Texas accent or a Plains accent. I'm from North Carolina, but country enough. And so being accused of being a cowboy is certainly something that's happened in my past, and I kind of like it.
It's a compliment.
It's a compliment. It's absolutely a compliment. Although, as soon as I meet a cowboy, they sure know I am not one. But that's all right.
So the great thing about 250 for 250 is the money has already been appropriated through the Sustains Act 2023. So you've got existing dollars that aren't being utilized in a productive way. And you've got the Natural Resource Conservation Service, part of the USDA, uh, which has a program called Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, where you can benefit the grasslands that are part of the Southern Great Plains at the same time as you're protecting the habitat of the lesser prairie chicken. So you've got what is a win-win with existing money to solve the permitting problem of what energy dominance must have. What you got to do is solve the problem. And 250,000 acres to coincide with the 250th birthday of the United States of America to protect our heritage of the Southern Great Plains is a true win-win.
250,000 acres, for context, is huge. I'd say from 2014 to today, the service has only 30,000 acres worth of conservation that meets their standards. There's another 30,000 acres there from a couple of other programs that aren't considered as durable. But so let's just, for benefit of the doubt, let's say they've got 60,000 acres on the books for lesser prairie chicken conservation since 2014. So what we're proposing to do is 250,000 acres before the end of Trump's second term. That is one heck of a conservation push and should be a defensible position for the service to hang its hat on a not warranted decision that I'm sure will be challenged in court, but I'm equally sure is defensible in court. JP, got some thoughts?
This is an opportunity for something bold and transformative. 250 for 250 is putting together 250,000 acres to coincide with the nation's 250th birthday and honor the heritage of the Southern Great Plains, the ranchers that have made their living there for hundreds of years. And we're going to do it with money that's already been appropriated through the Farm Bill, leveraged with the Sustains Act, so that we're going to get additional resources from corporations. And we're going to do something bold that is transformative for the lesser prairie chicken